Здравствуйте.
Здравствуйте, Мария, еще раз. Здравствуйте, дорогие друзья. Я всех приветствую. Меня зовут Алексей Глухов. И у нас сегодня замечательное событие в рамках нашего научного семинара «Школы, философии и культурологии». Выступает Keti Chukhrov. Она представляет свою книгу «Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in the Soviet Socialism». И у нас есть замечательные комментаторы, оппоненты, которых будет повод тоже представить. Пока мы еще собираемся, я еще замечу, что наш семинар двуязычный, поэтому часть объявлений, видимо, мне как модератору нужно будет тоже делать на английском языке, но все могут подавать свои реплики на том языке, на котором вы желаете, да, высказываться на том языке, на котором желаете. Переводчик у нас, к сожалению, синхронных не предполагается. Dear friends, dear colleagues, it's an honor to me to host you here. This is our academic philosophical seminar, School of Philosophy, HSE, and this is our regular seminar, but an exceptional occasion. We have Keti Chukhrov here, who will be presenting her recent book, Practicing the Good, Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism. And so we are still waiting for others to join us. And so if you have any questions in advance concerning the procedure, this is the appropriate time to ask them. Our working languages are Russian and English, so we don't have interpreters, and everyone is free to speak the language of your choice.
Hello there. Hi, this is
Hi,
John here,
John.
John Roberts. What is the order of speakers?
Just a moment. We're trying to figure it out. I have to ask one question from our scientific supervisor of this seminar, Professor Владимир Анатольевич Порос. Владимир Анатольевич, будут какие-то с вашей стороны реплики, или он сейчас отошел как раз? Владимир Анатольевич, вы будете что-то говорить в начале этого семинара?
Нет, уважаемые коллеги, все сказано. Я поздравляю всех с новым заседанием нашего интенсивно работающего семинара Вольфила. И очень рад видеть здесь старых друзей, которых давно не видел. Андрей, привет. Вот. Да и всех нас. Я желаю успеха нашему семинару.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And so the procedure. So we, as we agreed with Keti, first we will give her time to present her book, half an hour. And then after that, we have so a group of opponents and commenters, and you will have 7 to 10 minutes for what you want to share with us. And so we don't have any particular order. But
just to tell Alexei,
yes.
Nikolai Ssорин-Чайков told me that he doesn't want to be the first.
Yeah. Yes, I received the message from him as well. So then we have other commenters, Professor John Робертс here.
Hello, hi.
Yes. Ilya Budraitskis is here. Yes. Then Andrei Madanski is here as well. And finally, Nikolai Ssорин-Чайков, who will be joining us later.
So I'm already here. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry. You're here.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. Then, without further ado, I yield the floor to Keti. Please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you for organizing this session and Thanks everyone to be present, and I would like to thank all the speakers that agreed to join me and to discuss this book. And first and foremost, I would like to thank John Roberts, who was my supervisor during my Marie Curie fellowship in London and Wolverhampton University, and without his contributions and discussions, probably this book wouldn't be possible. Also, I would like to thank the e-flux publishing house, as well as University of Minnesota Press. The book is called Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism, and usually the question is always concerning the title: why desire, why boredom, what is the methodology, is it a historiographic study of the Soviet context, is it a Slavonic study? So just to answer all those questions about the context and methodological framework of the book, I will follow my paper, and it will take me maybe 25-30 minutes. So I will try to delineate the features of methodology of my research. There are three main vectors in the studies of historical socialism. First, historiographic study, implying analysis of various heritages, literary, philosophic, artistic, including archaeology and anthropology of sociality and lifestyles. Second method is studies of concrete personalia in culture philosophy in the context of broader theoretic phenomena, which pertains to the field of comparative studies. And third is critique of ideology and its social and historical consequences in the frame of communist past or October Revolution from the either affirmative or derogatory perspective. Thus, apart from certain exceptions, we deal in this case with historical socialism as the domain of archaeology, certain sort of antiquity, which never becomes a contemporary political or critical tool. And interestingly, such archaeological view prevails equally among the anti-Soviet Cold War standpoints, as well as in the leftist research of historical socialism since the 60s. This entails two consequences: this archaeological squeezing of the Soviet experience into antiquity, that if one researches, let's say, the works of Vygotsky or Ilyenkov, one rarely shifts to the concrete politeconomic realia or material culture or production. And the figures of personalia of Soviet Marxism are then often researched in certain sorts of ghetto without being inscribed into the worldwide context of critical theory. For example, when you submit a text on the Soviet philosophy into the Slavonic journal, and you have references to Negri or Deleuze, there is always some kind of argument that these two contexts are not connected. So, and vice versa, the scholars specializing the Marxist theorists generally often dismiss Soviet Marxist theory as pre-modern or outdated. So quite a number of institutional and methodological problems here, as you see. And the path that I chose to follow in this connection enabled me to ground the analysis of cultural and philosophic edifices of socialism on politeconomic factors, such as the eradicated private property, for example, that is, consider theoretical, ideological, and socioeconomic aspects on one plane. So this is the reason why I unified in the books 4 parts, which usually in the research are impossible to unify: political economy, sexuality, aesthetics, philosophy. And such approach encompassing the thought, the theory on the one hand, and the modes of living in the conditions of socialist economy on the other, had to prove interdependence of the epistemes of thought with the polит-economic dispositions. So what was important for me to connect somehow the philosophic epistemes and to show how dependent they are on the polит-economic dispositions of the socialist society. But this inevitably led me to the comparison of the Soviet imaginaries of emancipation with the Western anti-capitalist critique amidst capitalism. This enabled not only to unravel how cultural and philosophic categories function in the socialist conditions, but also to apply socialist political economy and socialist ethics as a litmus paper of discerning the problems in the Western post-war emancipatory theory since Althusser, or generally speaking in the anti-capitalist Western Marxist critique. So this book, to a certain extent, is not simply about Soviet context and Soviet thought, but it checks the emancipation theories of the 60s in the Western context as well. Now, what were the principal landmarks in questioning why the similar notions such as the ideal, culture, consciousness, desire, pleasure, the universal, the language, labor, produce converse impact in the context of capitalist leftism and the socialist one. So this was really important for me to compare why the same epistemes and the same notions function in a converse way. And the result of this comparison was the following. What was dismissed negatively as metaphysical, idealist, authoritarian, and even marked as ideology in the post-Althusserian critical thought, I already enumerated those notions: culture, ideal, the universal, the common good. The same notions were acquiring affirmative and materialist connotations in the thought of historical socialism. And in one of my research texts preceding the book, The Epistemological Gaps Between the Soviet East and the Democratic West, this was the title, I tried to argue that the socio-political differences between historical socialism and the liberal democratic and generally Western leftism arise from divergent epistemological treatment of notions listed above. And just to mention a couple of examples of how they function differently. For example, we all know the dismissal of the unconscious in the Soviet philosophy and psychology in the works of Voloshinov, Ilyenkov, Vygotsky, Leontiev, and of course I had to account for this divergence and difference. Or the apologia among the Soviet thinkers of such notions as culture and ideal, when these concepts had been completely defied since Adorno's aesthetic theory, Freud's psychoanalysis, or further on in the critique of ideology after Althusser. Or let's take the notion of the classical or realism in art and aesthetics, which traditionally are regarded as the outcome of partocratic cultural politics, but in my book, I treat them as the regimes of de-alienation. And last but not least, the role of language, how language is criticized. For example, in Ilyenkov's philosophy or Alexei Leontiev's psychology, what is placed before language, ahead of language, is not the unconscious or any instinctive drives or affectations, but this is the imprint of history, culture. So something that stands before the abstraction and generalization of language is even more general, is even more nominal. In other words, the potentialities of the generic, this is what stands behind the language or ahead of language, an approach that would be impossible in psychoanalysis, structuralism, or even more so in post-structuralism. So as the book argues, these divergences between East and West are not about geopolitics and are not about East and West, actually, but they have polит-economic causality, which means that these drastically converse approaches in the socialist and capitalist context, respectively, to the essential notions forming ontology, sociality, do not derive from party imperatives, but they are consequences of sequestered capitalism. So I was trying to consider those divergences through abolished private property and certain features of use value economy as against the surplus value economics. In other words, the notions that in the conditions of capitalist production denote certain universal rules of ontology and henceforth function as dead abstractions, in the context of socialism acquire concrete material body and appliance. Such notions as I already listed: culture, the ideal, language, the universal. And actually, if we look at the book of Ewald Elyonkov, The Dialectics of the Abstract and the Concrete, it is dedicated completely to how general and immaterial abstract phenomena such as value or language or the ideal are formed by means of material concretions and are therefore both general and materially embodied. Meanwhile, parallel to this, in capitalist conditions, the social constructivism and teleology become the representations of rule, power, order, so that even the common good has to be undermined, as it can only be the false and illusory common good. Therefore, all the notions that represent certain social constructivism are immediately labeled as apparatuses, as order, as subjugation. And interestingly, now I will shift to the problematics of mind and matter, because this was crucial and essential, how to converge and how to unify mind and matter, this huge metaphysical problem of the dualism of mind and matter. And it's really a diagnosis, and it's really symptomatic what happened to this dualism, for instance, starting from post-structuralism up to post-humanist theories of contemporaneity. This was the crucial issue to be solved as well, how to twist this duality into unification. And what we see in post-human theories is that they solve this dualism, this rupture between the mind and matter, between nominal and material empirical categories, through either choosing algorithmicized mind, like, for instance, Riza Nigaristani or Ray Kurzweil. So they either choose the total rationalization, the mathematized mind, or others such as Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, Karen Barat, actor network theory, completely dismiss the realms of the idea, the language, any extracorporeal or transcendental categories, dismiss the necessity of conceptual parameters in favor of delegating meaning production to pure performative agency of empirical elements, the path that chooses performative nominalism. And in both cases, whether choosing abstract mind and linguistic mathematicized categories, or the empirical performatism, we fall into the trap of abstraction. And just to add that human being is the combination of mind and matter. So it is clear that if there is no possibility to connect these two categories, then the human being disperses and splits. And therefore it is only natural that we have to come to post-human theory. Whereas in classical metaphysics, for instance, there were problems, there were ruptures between mind and matter, but these two categories were kept in tension through various methodologies, and dialectics was one of them. Thus, I had to follow Ilyenkov's approach in this treatment of mind and matter, because we see in socialist psychology and in Marxist thought persistent conviction that Marxist theory could facilitate resolving this problem of metaphysics. So the claim of socialist philosophy was that they could somehow facilitate convergence of mind and body. Yet this could not be done performatively, but had to be done through materialist dialectics. And now I will try to show how political economy is used to prove that this realization of metaphysical or gnoseological problem is possible in thought. And this was, of course, the idea of Ilyenkov, that with the revolutionary turnover of the sociality, not only the modes of production, but the very material basis, even the ontic parameters of being change. And consequently, such changes entail new epistemologies. Not only social infrastructure transforms in a deprivatized economy, but also the conditions of materiality. And in this sense, Ilyenkov's theory of the ideal would be difficult to imagine without the polit-economic conditions of socialism and without his reliance on the Marxist political economy. And when I claim this, many researchers, they try to fiercely argue this because they want to look upon the interpretation of the ideal by Ilyenkov separately from dependence of this issue on the political economy. And actually, Ilyenkov himself answers this puzzle about the fusion and connectedness of the issues of the ideal, of the issues of how to converge mind and body, and the political economy of Marxist-Leninist method. He claims that in his piece, Question of Identity of Thought and Being in Pre-Marxist Philosophy, and explicitly says that identification of thought and reality could be accomplished in practice only in the Marxist, through the Marxist theory, and only this would enable to identify nominal and material parameters. Why? Because the eidetic, generic, basic function of a material thing manifests itself at its best in a deprivatized economy and due to the sequestered surplus value in economic production. And I quote Ilyenkov here, Marxism also takes into account the fact that under conditions of the division of labor and the alienation of thought, the transformation of being into thought and thought into being takes place via an extremely complex prism of mediations that is of purely social nature. Which means that by this assertion, Ilyenkov emphasizes that capitalist political economy hampers the possibility of converging thought and being, and this impossibility is not simply ontological, it is polit-economic. And only after I finished my book, I came across a very strange document which is a letter of Ilyenkov to the Central Committee of Communist Party. Allegedly, he wrote it in the beginning of 60s, and it's titled "On the Position in Philosophy." And in this letter, it's a bit ironic and even funny. He writes directly to the representatives of government and Politburo and shares his worries about the insufficient influence of philosophy in Soviet society. In this letter, Ilyenkov urges the Central Committee to increase the influence of Marxist norms in philosophy, because to his mind, Marxist political economy should have a bigger impact on philosophy, and vice versa. Socialist society should be more deeply permeated by philosophic gnoseology, departing from the Marxist standpoint. So to a certain extent, this letter shows that he is even more radical than the Communist Party, which in comparison to Ilyenkov's demands appears a kind of liberal dissidence. Yet what is essential in this standpoint, and what is the discovery of socialist philosophy and Ilyenkov per se, is that Marxist political economy is not simply economic tool, but it unravels economic analysis as a field of philosophic gnoseology. Consequently, this leads to the main appeal of Ilyenkov, according to which socialist production, revolution, and political economy could become the polygon of philosophic speculation. And thus, the political economy is not simply the applied tools of social construction. So deprivatized economy can produce the context to study dialectical convergence of thought and being, but as well to implement the dialectical convergence of thought and being. Thus, it is crucial that the ideal and the question about joining matter and mind is not simply the theoretical study, but it is a condition that is realizable politeconomically. And interestingly, Boris Groys, in his The Communist Postscript, emphasizes precisely this nominal character of material culture of the Soviet Union, claiming that what in capitalist conditions is an exchange, in communist conditions becomes a linguistic, nominal, conceptual category. Now another principal section of the book considers the libidinal components of economy and derives from the broader analysis of surplus value in economy, in psychics and production. And many ask me, how come the issues of sexuality or libidinality are connected with either the socialist context or emancipatory context, or the context of metaphysical treatment of mind and matter. And I try to explain this. So surplus value is seen not merely as an economic factor, but as we see in research since Marx, and in contemporary research and in psychoanalysis, it is intertwined with the phantasmatic and narcissistic aspects of capitalist production of desire. So surplus value is somehow linked with the production of desire. That's how we come to the subtitle of the book, Desire and Boredom in Soviet Socialism. If desire is something instigated by surplus value economics, so if we have surplus value in capitalism, and if this surplus value is instigated by desire, then logically, the eradication of surplus value in socialism would suppose circumcision of that desire. So if we simply cut surplus value, we cut the libidinal parameters of production, and we cut the necessity and some sort of emancipatory constructivism of desire, which is both creative, but at the same time can be characteristic for the capitalist production. Some would argue that even though the aspect of desire and the libidinality has been broadly debated in the critique of capitalism since 70s, in the works by Lyotard, Deleuze-Guattari, Lourdon, at present, the issues of the libidinal context had been discussed by John Roberts, who is present with us, and his forthcoming book is also titled The Limitations of Capitalism and Desire.
Capitalism and the Limits of Desire.
Capitalism and Limits of Desire, it's the other way around. And Samo Tomsic's Capitalist Unconscious. Still, many theorists argue that Marx did not dwell on the libidinal aspects of capitalist production, as he was much more focused on the issues of subsumption of living labor, correlation of productive forces, and the relations of productions. This is definitely true, yet Marx dedicated special attention to commodity fetishism and the convertedness of forms in the commodity production, which definitely resonates with the phantasmatic and tempting character inscribed in a commodity, and inevitably hinges on the symbolic parameters of surplus value. For example, in the subchapter titled The Meaning of Human Requirements, where there is private property, in his The Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes that production grounded in private property produces the urgency of need. By consequence, production starts to function in this case as the encourager of necessitated novelties and new enjoyments. And Marx uses this lexicon. He uses the word urgency of need, and he uses the word enjoyment. In this case, as Marx adds paradoxically, the growth of necessities simultaneously generates a lack of necessities. And this is already a Lacanian dialectics of the drive and of lack. And in fact, this passage of Marx gives a formula of how private property actually generates the artificial novelty, the converted form of object, which is this necessitated novelty, which acquires its forms of production via surplus value. And indeed, Marx doesn't use the lexicon of libidinal economy, yet this passage explicitly manifests that by determining private property as the urgency of need, Marx emphasizes quasi-crypto-libidinal character of capitalist production, in which that very urgent need is in fact the surplus desire, which eventually transforms itself into surplus value. So it is precisely in this connection, dialectics of desire, surplus value, libidinality, that the aspects of sexuality arise, that the aspects of sexuality can be considered at all. Namely, I observe sexuality in its dependence on the production of desire, and sexuality is seen as something that departs from the libidinal forms of economics and is declined in the conditions of the non-libidinal forms of economics. So again, sexuality becomes the operator to see the libidinal forms of economic production and non-libidinal socialist forms of economic production. And in this connection, I try to look at a few Soviet texts discussing the unimportance of enjoyment for socialist society, and the texts which delink sexuality and its psychics and lexicons from biological sex, such as Voloshinov's Freudianism or Andrei Platonov's Antisexus, and a few others. To conclude, this is my last paragraph. I would add that when I started working on this book, many aspects of it were met with fierce argument. For example, the notions of de-alienation, or the issues of Marxist humanism, or critique of techno-essentialism, or the emancipatory potential of basic need economy, critique of enjoyment, etc. All that was labeled as passé, as outdated, and as the creations of totalitarian society disguised into emancipatory narrative. But it is truly symbolic that during this pandemic, numerous appeals against capitalism stepped out of the idea of micro changes, of gradual imminent transformations, demanding those very drastic decisionist measures, calling for precisely these acts of de-alienation, collapse of enjoyment and desire, understood as emancipation, and demanding even basic need economy, as we came across in recent texts by Zizek and Franco Berardi. I would end here, and thanks. It's exactly 30 minutes.
Yes, perfect timing. Thank you very much. And we have a number of replies. Professor John Roberts, Professor Andrei Madanski, Ilya Budraitskis. Who will be the first? It's up to you.
I'll go first.
Yes, please go ahead. Professor John Roberts, Professor of Art and Aesthetics at the University of Wolverhampton.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say that Keti's book is extraordinarily impressive and important. And what I'd like to do this afternoon, UK time, is explain in some detail why that is the case. In fact, I don't think Keti, in her introduction, has actually done justice to the innovative qualities of her own work. So what I want to do now is touch on some of those innovative qualities in the book and our writing generally. And I want to do this by concentrating on two things: the nature, the political, economic, and social nature of the Soviet system, and Keti's account of her account of post-capitalist emancipation based upon her reading of late Soviet experience. Okay, so there are three positions on the nature of the USSR, and these three positions were developed largely in the 1940s and 1950s. The first is that the Soviet Union was in a transition state towards full communism, and that's the standard Stalinist or reform Stalinist position. Position two, that is, Russian society was neither capitalist nor socialist, although the forces of production continue to develop. This will not lead to communism, just as the continuing exploitation of workers will not lead to capitalism. Stalinism, in fact, is a form of totalitarian barbarism suspended between capitalism and socialism. But this situation will be reversed. The bureaucratic depredations of the society will eventually lose their political character, releasing the non-repressive administrative capacities of the state in the struggle for a classless society. This theory of bureaucratic collectivism is identified with the writings of Max Shachtman, as you may know. For Shachtman, workers under bureaucratic collectivism are not proletarians. even though they are exploited. They are rather slaves, in as much as they are not free to sell their labor or bargain with their employer. Now, the third position, which is largely identifiable with the writings of Tony Cliff in the UK, is that Russia is state capitalist. Under socialism, the commodity form of wage labor continues, and the competition between enterprises continues in response to the pressures of the world economy. Now, in Chukhrov's book, Practicing the Good, she proposes a counter-historical account of these debates based on a radical revision of position 1, drawing on elements of position 3. So Soviet communism's economic failure, that is, its increasing productive inefficiency and contraction in the 1960s and 1970s, is paradoxically its strength. This rests on the system's post-capitalist realities, despite the system's residual state capitalist characteristics. Thus, for Chukhrov, what the revolution produced, despite Stalinism, and I quote from her here, is the criminalization of capitalist conditions. That is private property, surplus economy, fetishized consumption, and the aesthetics of libidinality that Keti has talked about. This derives from the fact that under the Soviet system, the payment of wages was not subject to a process of surplus extraction, but part of a system of common wealth. So labor was not subject to privatized accumulation. Thus, a basic needs system came into being. Interestingly, Chukhrov sees the greater achievement of the Soviet Union in these terms, lying in its mature phase, in its stagnant condition under the Brezhnev years, rather than in the earlier utopic period. I quote again from her: Soviet society attained a non-capitalist condition only by the late 1950s. In this, she rehistoricizes the communist experience in the Soviet Union. And this is where her work is quite extraordinary and innovative. Through an examination of how Soviet communism enacted an emancipatory critique of libidinal economy and the conditions for what I call in my new book that Keti has mentioned, non-repressive self-governance, non-repressive self-governance. Indeed, the underlying assumption of her argument is this, that given the ruling productivist paradigms on the anti-Stalinist left from the 1950s to the late 1980s, and you include those three positions that I discussed at the beginning, there was a widespread failure to see how the intersection between the suppression of the commodity form and the stagnant character of the Soviet economy had opened up an unprecedented space free from the competitive logic and libidinal drives of capitalism, despite the low standard of living and continuing state repression. And in fact, one of maybe the book would not have got written in the form that it got written in. One of the strange characteristics of the book is the fact that although Keti talks extensively about the idealization and ideality, there's no reference to, well, there's very little reference to the counter reality of those three categories. There's no mention of the camps. There's no mention of state repression, and there's no mention of what one might call a deep cultural conservatism, through those late mature years. Anyway, that's a topic for discussion at a later stage. So I'll pose a question. Is this model truly liberatory, or is it a ratiocinative justification of widespread inertia and pacification as freedom from competition, from capitalist competition in those 2 decades? Because for Chukhrov, our argument rests on the fact that it is not the Soviet Communist Party that ruled the USSR, but, and I quote again, the political, economic, and socio-ethical system and the infrastructure and epistemes generated through this system. Again, that's, I think, is an interesting topic for discussion. But this is a system, this is a philosophical system, and this ties into what Keti just said about the letter that Ilyankov wrote to the Central Committee. However, this is a system that the majority of citizens did not recognize or acknowledge. The implication being, therefore, that the Russian population for the last 20 years of the regime were in fact unconsciously participating in an experiment that they had no knowledge of, or indeed little sympathy for. And in turn, the party only had a formal investment in. Okay, given this, I want to talk, I don't know, how long have I got? I mean, I have a...
So up to 10 minutes, and your time is almost up, so 2 more minutes.
Okay, I just want to end my discussion briefly about the debate in a book around the productive forces and the relations of production, which I think is quite important. In socialism, the productive forces lag behind the relations of production. Indeed, during the late Soviet period, they never achieved any correlation. The immature conditions of the productive forces were never able to fit with the demands of constructing an advanced socialist society and the emancipation of labor. As according to this position, only the development of the productive forces can secure the development of socialism and communism. Chukhrov's counter-historical reading of the Soviet experiment refutes this attachment of socialism with the development of the productive forces. Attaching an anti-libidinal account of the common wealth produced by the Soviet common economy for use as a possible form of non-growth wealth, which of course is a debate that is very prevalent today, certainly through ecological questions. This links her account notionally to the late Marx and his correspondence in the early 1880s with the Russian populists, in particular Very Zazulich, on the significance of the Russian peasant commune as a possible post-capitalist form of social organization. For Marx, the primitive commune dialectically restored on a higher technological, for Marx, the primitive commune dialectically restored on a high technological and technical level is a way of avoiding the huge social and political costs of forced progress and industrialization. In this, Marx argued that there was no fatal necessity for the commune form to be destroyed by industrial capital. Advanced technology could be put to new uses under the control of the commune. So I'm going to come to my final remarks now then. So we might ask then, in the light of Marx's last writing, was Marx then a Promethean or a Soterian? Soteria was, as you may know, was the Greek goddess of safety and preservation. And Soterians tend to identify certain human technological relations with regulatory restraints and certain technological relinquishments. So I asked then, is Chukhrov's reading of the late Soviet experience through a critique of libidinal economy Soterian? That is it opposed, in her view, to the rise of a number of Promethean and techno-optimistic positions today? So finally, is Soterianism, which I identify in Keti's position, identifiable with this new post-growth politics? Thank you. Okay.
Okay, how shall we proceed? Keti, would you like to give a quick reply to this comment, or you will give a general reply to all the comments at the end?
I will answer afterwards, otherwise it will be longer.
Yes, thank you. Then Andrei Madanski or Ilya Budraitskis.
Can I be first?
Surely. Please go ahead. Ilya Budraitskis, political and cultural writer. He currently teaches in Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and in the School of Design at HSE and at ICA Moscow. Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to be short, as there are some more speakers. But the first thing to say that the very project of the very framework of Keti's book is very impressive and very promising. She, as I understood her main point, her main ambition, she's trying to present the Soviet reality, the Soviet society, as something unique, as a unique experience, but in the same time, not a kind of project that means a kind of totality. So in this sense, she, on one hand, opposed the quite widespread idea of the, let's say, opposition of the different elements of the Soviet history, of the Soviet experience to each other. Like we had good 20s and bad Stalinism, or we had the rise of the Soviet project in the beginning and the degradation in the latest decades. But Keti is trying to present this experience as unique. And in this sense, this unique experience, as I understood her point, is not a kind of total. So it means that there are certain contradictions in this experience, which are very special to and very related to its core. And in this sense, they are different from the contradictions in the capitalist society. And in this sense, it's very much related to the approach, for example, proposed by the late Georg Lukács in his famous essay on socialist realism, where he said that probably the best example of how socialist realism should be implemented is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day of Ivan Denisovich, because it refers to contradictions and the real conditions of the socialist society. And the main question, the main contradiction of this society is a moral contradiction, is a moral question, which is different from the let's say social economic contradictions in a capitalist society. So here I think there is a difference between Keti's approach and Boris Groys's approach, because on one hand you can see some similarities, some clear ties between them. Like for Groys and his Communist Postscriptum, he basically propose the approach that the Soviet experience was a direct implementation of the philosophy to a material praxis. So it was a philosophy in action. And Keti shared this view, but she tried to not to present the Soviet experience as a totality, as a pure the pure power of the language under their material reality. And in this sense, it's very interesting that she's trying to contextualize her analysis of the Soviet with the Western leftist and anti-capitalist critics of the 60s, which was mostly based on the idea that, as Adorno pointed out, when philosophy already lost its chance to be implemented in material reality. So the Soviet experience was a kind of the chance of this implementation, and we should take this chance, this experience of this concrete implementation of the philosophies, something very very important, very valid for our further anti-capitalist critics of today. And of course, this Keti's framework is very rich and very promising, and she actually explains how this optics could work on some concrete fields like the Soviet cinema or Soviet literature, etc. So I have basically three questions to Keti. So the first one is the question about the very category of socialism, which is widely used in her book as a kind of synonym of the Soviet reality itself. So we know that the idea that the Soviet reality was a direct implementation of some kind of socialism as the let's say social form came from the official Soviet ideology. So we couldn't find the definition of what is the socialism, which is different from communism in Marx or Lenin or other classic Marxist writers. So for the initial approach of Marx and Lenin, we mainly get the idea of the worker state as a kind of transitionary form. And socialism is a kind of essential form. So it's not a kind of transition, but it's a definition of something already existed. And in this sense, I will share the previous comment by John Roberts, where he compare it with Schachman or Tony Cliff's approach, who that proposed some concrete definitions for that experience instead of talking about it as just a kind of transition from the capitalism to communism. So my question is, what is the socialism? How she can deal with all these difficulties about this definition? The second point is more specific, is about Keti's approach to Marx legacy, because she mostly used Marx's concept of alienation from the economic philosophical manuscripts, the early works of Marx, but all the criticism of ideology, commodity fetishism, and so on came not from the early Marx, but from Capital, and that what was basically the main point of famous Althusserian epistemological gap in between the early and later Marx. So why Keti took this early, let's say, Marxist, humanist, Hegelian notion of alienation instead of the method of capital, which is basically have a lot of differences and which could be in some sense more productive and more relevant in this framework of her research about the Western anti-capitalist criticism of 60s, 70s, and so on. And the third question is a bit of provocative, but I think is very important because if we took Boris Groys' approach to the Soviet from his communist postscriptum, we can describe it as a kind of distant irony towards the Soviet experience. So Groys definitely doesn't associate himself with this experience, and he distantly makes some intellectual points and games around this reflection of this experience. But it seems that the position of Keti used to be a bit different. So where you, Keti, are positioning yourself towards the Soviet experience for the moment. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next comment by Andrei Madanski, professor in philosophy at Belgrade National Research University and associate researcher at the Institute of Philosophy, Russian Academy of Science. Please go ahead.
Спасибо большое. Я буду выступать по-русски. И, во-первых, в строках хотел бы, конечно, поздравить автора Кети с этой замечательной книгой. Бросается в глаза уже ее внешность, я имею в виду книгу, конечно, и эта обложка такая авангардистская, да, с рекомендациями, очень солидными рекомендациями корифеев на обороте. Вот, я лично вот что увидел в этой книге, об этом отчасти уже сама Кети сказала, это результат такого процесса дистилляции советской философской мысли. Мало что от нее осталось за 30 лет, вот пока шел этот процесс дистилляции. И это то, что вот осталось, мы можем видеть в книгах новых, которые сейчас выходят, книги Кети. Да, это такой как сорт бренди, выдержанный, так сказать, вот в контекстах, как она говорит, или в дубовых бочках таких Лакана, Делеза, Гваттари, Леотара, Жижика. Вот. Но это не только бочки постмодерна, это и Адорно, и Лукач, то есть такая западная неомарксистская традиция, которая, конечно, родственна по духу, более родственна по духу главным советским персонажам книги Ильенкову, Выгодскому и Лившицу. Вот я не могу не одобрить очень-очень горячо выбор Кети, ее вкус, потому что эти три имени, как уже сейчас достаточно прояснилось, и есть то ценное, что советский марксизм оставил в наследство мировому духу, так сказать. Остальное в процессе дистилляции испарилось, было списано в утиль, но остались какие-то, может, следы незначительные сравнительно, а вот эти трое остались. И сегодня их труды издаются, обсуждаются, причем по восходящей, набирая обороты, издаются архивные вещи. Вот только что вышла новые тексты Лившица. Сегодня на выставке книжной они были. Немало интересного. То, что авторы не могли напечатать при жизни. И мне близка базисная мысль, которая в книге Кэти звучит, что социализмы вот эти 20 века и советский социализм в частности, вот как и искусство авангарда, они насквозь пропитаны духом капитализма. И самая радикальная критика капитализма не столько отрицает, сколько доводит до предела, иногда до гротеска, внутренняя тенденция этого вот строя жизни, буржуазного, как говорят, или порожденного частной собственностью. Когда-то подобную мысль высказал Маркс, молодой Маркс в 1944 году. Он писал, что коммунизм в его первой форме является лишь обобщением и завершением отношений частной собственности. И вот то, что мы знаем под именем Советский Союз, это и есть коммунизм в его первой форме. В этой форме, пишет Маркс, он выступает как всеобщая частная собственность. Грубый коммунизм, пишет он, есть только форма проявления гнусности частной собственности, желающая утвердить себя в качестве положительной общности. Ну вот то, что Маркс писал о коммунистических теориях, да, своего времени, Кети уже знает и пишет о практиках социализма, вот, который, в общем, и есть этот грубый коммунизм, перекочевавший из книжек в жизнь. Кети анализирует свершившийся исторический опыт, но в основном не напрямую, как это делают историки или экономист, хотя в книге есть моменты, значит, об экономике тоже говорится. Вот, но в основном она изучает такие отражения этого советского опыта в зеркалах искусства, философии, сексуальности. Вот, кстати, Маркс, как мы помним, утверждал, что отношение к женщине вообще выдает тайну коммунизма, и именно по отношению к женщине лучше всего судить о ступени общей культуры человека. Это цитата. Вот, и в этом смысле ну, вот эти как бы подхватывает, разрабатывает, развивает, не всегда ссылаясь, хотя о Марксе достаточно много говорится, вот эти, так сказать, ранние ценные такие мысли Маркса. Ну, мне показалась также интересная мысль, Кети, что, я процитирую, модернистское и авангардистское отрицание культуры может рассматриваться как решение наказать себя, to self-punish, за атрофию культуры. Авангардизм – это такое культурное садомазо. Да? Мне кажется, Лившицу тоже понравилась бы эта метафора. Ну и как человек, вскормленный текстами Ильенкова, я хотел бы особо поблагодарить Кети за 2 главы об Эвальде Васильевиче, в частности, за космологический гуманизм, о котором мало что, ну, такое, собственно, авторское название, о котором мало что известно на Западе, да и у нас не очень-то люди знают. Да? А ведь это такая в эстетическом, по крайней мере, плане очень мощная, впечатляющая вещь. Высшая эсхатология, которая не пессимистична, если цитировать Кети. Значит, это очень верная оценка. Вот недавно Жижик тоже у нас написал про космологию духа, но гораздо слабее. Значит, и вообще как-то не очень вразумительно, я бы сказал. Вот, Кети передала основные идеи этой работы. И, значит, учитывая, что недавно вышел английский перевод космологии духа и немецкий, кстати, Борис Гройс как раз его издал. Вот, ну, все это очень хорошо и способствует того, что этот железный занавес, который мешал Ильенкову по многим позициям высказываться и не позволил даже опубликовать космологию духа. Вот он сейчас усилиями вот таких авторов, как Кети, он поднимается, наконец, с некоторым опозданием, но, тем не менее, эти замечательные, на мой взгляд, вещи становятся доступны для западного читателя. Причем доступны не просто, так сказать, в виде пересказа. Да? Ну, это была ценность пересказа, она, как говорится, тоже имеет место быть. Вот. Но здесь Ильенко, он вовлекается в такой диалог, да? Диалог с западными, современными западными мыслителями. Вот. Иногда в противостоянии там, со спекулятивным реализмом, иногда, так сказать, вот, просто перекличку с идеями какими-то западными, Делеза. Вот. И, ну, это самый короткий, на мой взгляд, путь к уму западного читателя. И в этом смысле стратегия Кети очень эффективная. В этом заключается и главная польза, на мой взгляд. Книги, польза в том, что выстраивается такой мост, осуществляется связь, живая связь между лучшими идеями советских марксистов и современностью, современной философией, социальными практиками, разными культурными течениями. Потому что без такой связи самая ценная мысль, она превращается в такой музейный экспонат. В лучшем случае музейный экспонат, а в худшем просто забывается. Вот. Самая лучшая память – это когда идеи работают в современной культуре. И вот это, я считаю, в этом заключается ценность книги, которую мы сегодня обсуждаем. Спасибо за внимание. В общем, я очень рад выходу этой книги.
Thank you. And we have one more comment by Professor Ссорин-Чайков. I don't know if he's online with us or not, if he's ready. Yes, thank you very much, Professor Nikolai Ссорин-Чайкov, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg. Please.
Yes, I wonder if you could actually let me share my screen, because I actually have typed up my comments. So
absolutely, I can. Just a moment. Yes, I did.
Fantastic. All right. Brilliant. So let me just go. Okay, thank you very much. So my questions are going to be anthropological, that is the ones that are made from the point of view of the when philosophy becomes social theory, and then it in turn is open to ethnography, that is concrete, specific research. In this case, ethnography and history of Soviet socialism. So I'd like to second Ilya Bodraitsky's question. It's not very clear what Keti means by socialism. So it'd be something interesting to explore, to ask her to elaborate. I don't agree with John Roberts on where are the camps. And I think the previous commentator already made this point that actually where's any kind of Soviet reality, desires, economies, ideas about what is good, any culture in the anthropological sense of the word. So of course it's the book is not about that. Just to give a very brief example, something that I'm exploring, if you take this portrait of Lenin, which was made in the late 1920s, Art of Human Hair, by a hairdresser who gave it as a gift to the newly established Museum of Lenin. So he and this is also not to some of the Moscow conceptualism, which, as Boris Groys wants to approach from the point of view of the ready-made kind of Soviet objects, but actually also never quite getting to the actually ready-made Soviet objects. So this is a gift to the Lenin Museum from someone who accompanies it with an enormous letter, very long letter, asking, basically saying that in exchange for these gifts, I want, and he has the whole list of things. He wants a new flat on the house on the embankment. He wants a job in the Kremlin, etc., etc. So of course he never gets it, precisely because he desires it so much, and it's a wrong thing to do, to express such desires together with this kind of gift giving. So this is as far as the kind of Soviet reality is concerned, and as far as the actual desires and commodities, objects, material goods and things that were circulating in Soviet society. But that's again, as I say, it's not really the point of the book. I take it to be something else altogether. And I don't think it's also a problem to deploy theory in research work and publications. Perhaps a little bit it's a problem in a kind of area studies journals, but that's precisely because they're kind of atheoretical by default, if you like. But I think the problem is more of a problem than that would be to deprovincialize theory, which I think Keti's work does very brilliantly. Which reveals what we often take for granted is basically Western hegemony, of Western conceptual hegemony. So I really appreciate that, and the comments and the questions that I have are really kind of a clarification. I'd really like to use the opportunity for Keti to explain a little bit more. For example, to draw my question one, I have like 3 questions or points. question one would be to elaborate the comparison between Ilyenkov and Althusser, and perhaps also Godelier, to whom Keti refers in her work. So of course it's interesting to bounce the two ideas against one another, thinking how the concept of idea in Ilyenkov works in parallel or in contrast with the concept of ideology, and in Althusser and in the kind of revisions of Marx, despite all the kind of the points that Ilya made about the kind of like, which Marx are we talking about here? It's actually really interesting that what Keti charts is the two parallel processes. There's on the one hand a development of a less materialist, if you like, perspective within Western critical theory, particularly exemplified by Althusser's treatment of ideology. And there's a very interesting parallel development of the thinking about ideas. So I'd like to perhaps, Keti, spend a little bit more time explicitly comparing and contrasting these two authors on that front. Don't think actually my I don't think my presentation is now moving, so I'll have to finish it without turning my slides anyway. But my second question that I wanted to put to Keti is basically to talk a little bit about people who are not in the book. In particular, I thought of it would be really interesting to compare the methodology of not just Ilyenkov, but also of Vladimir Bibler, who was another very important philosopher and who also developed a very interesting concept which runs parallel to the discussion of alienation, but actually stems from the positioning axiomatic foundations of knowledge and the categorical imperative as not simply something which is taken for granted within a system of thought, but actually as the other within a given tradition of thought. So from that point of view, the process of materialization that Keti is describing, drawing on Ilyenkov as and his example of the jar, which kind of embodies the whole previous history. I think if you look at Bibler, then it becomes not necessarily accumulation, but internal othering. And he applies that specifically to the to thinking about how we can actually think about the history of philosophy and history of science as a constant production of internal otherness within its own conceptual thought. So that would be quite an interesting parallel. And my final point, with which I wanted to also show a couple of other examples, but since my slides don't move, you'll have to live with the first illustration that I've demonstrated, which was this portrait of Lenin made of human hair. And I would like to just draw attention to the fact that there isn't just Marxism in Ilyenkov's sense, or in Bibler's sense, or in all the senses of other philosophers that we mentioned today, both Russian and Western, but also there's such a thing as what I, as well as Anna Kruglova, who I think is in the audience, called Vernacular Marxism, which is basically everyday Marxist imagination, which is done very much in the form of, for example, gifts like these. And I think this is a very good example of, on the one hand, what Keti is talking about, such as the way Soviet reality produced this kind of ready-made conceptual objects. But I don't think neither Boris Groys himself, nor, I'm afraid, probably Keti in this particular work goes far enough to conceptualize these kind of practices. So I think these three questions would: one, clarification on Ilyenkov versus Althusser, the other one for the possible place of Bibler in this, and the third about Marxism and vernacular Marxism. These would be my questions for discussion for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, Andrei, Ilya, Nikolai. really excellent question, and I'm really honored for the fact that such a conspicuous thinkers just dedicated time to this book. So I'm extremely, extremely and deeply grateful. Well, I start with John's question, and the main question, which was really crucial. Liberation from competitive logic due to non-growth development of economy and lagging behind of productive forces. Yes, truly, this is an important thing, but I think that I didn't develop it sufficiently because this would entail the analysis of technology and the role of technology, which was extremely important in the beginning of avant-garde, but which declined and shifted only to military domain, but it did not develop in retail goods, consumption, traditions, and gradually was becoming less and less efficient, so that Soviet lifestyle looked like equality in poverty, equality in squalor to a certain extent. And I even use this word squalor. But then my argument is if there is no surplus value, and I just follow John's comment, if there is no surplus value and no desire and no striving and excess of acceleration and no Promethean productivism, then probably there is this inevitable fall into the stagnation that paradoxically we cannot answer this question because we do not know other variants of socialism. We do not know the proper Marxist way of socialism, and we do not know whether the proper Marxist mode of socialism would bring to the same result. So this was a rhetorical and regulative question, whether the sequestering and cutting of surplus and of desire and of libidinality will bring production to these squalid forms of material culture. So probably I would agree when John makes this differentiation between Promethean techno-optimism and Satyrian sorry?
Soterianism.
Satyrianism with this post-growth politics. Well, it's not that I'm choosing each of these as an ideology, but it's just constatation of the symptoms of the sociality which made this choice in favor of distributive economy, thus somehow petrifying movement and petrifying speeds of development. Although the word ускорение, speed, was very important in Soviet 50s and 60s, but this was much more connected with the cosmic developments, military developments, and more a metaphoric mythology. The daily life did not look accelerated, I would say, in the socialist context. On the contrary, one would compare the temporality of socialism with some kind of arrested eternity. So really valuable observations about freedom from competitive logic. And another point concerning John's comments about infrastructure, which is ruling much more than the party itself. Yes, a very precise observation, because you also mentioned people who were not aware what experiment they are participating in exactly, because infrastructure was smarter and already organized as the Marxist algorithm, so that as the communist algorithm, so that
could I say something there? Could we say then, just as the productive forces lagged behind the relations of production, we might say that the party lagged behind the communist ideal.
Absolutely, yes. This was my point, that the ruling point is the communist idea, and the party has to adhere to it. It has to squeeze itself and to attain this validity of the communist idea. So infrastructure is more communist than the daily life, and therefore my point was, which I did not somehow articulate initially, that the Soviet Union decomposed not because of lack of socialism or lack of communism, but it had too much communism, which was unbearable for the daily conditions. So infrastructure was more rigid and more ideal than the possibility to adhere and implement it. Now I would shift to Ilya's questions, 3 questions. What is socialism? Yes, absolutely true, because this is the point of Balibar when he says that there is no autonomous socialism. It's just transition from capitalism to communism, and therefore socialist state is not valid, because a struggle within capitalism is much more communism than this absolutely autonomized socialist state, which can only be a transitory passage. But there is also remark of Engels, which I'm bringing, I forgot where from, when he's saying that socialism is also some kind of experimental rehearsal. It's like scientific rehearsal. So in this sense, I would rather take socialism not as transition from one formation to another social formation, but rather as experimental rehearsal. And in terms of rehearsal, I would think that the personalia with around revolution and around Third International were aware that this was a rehearsal. They would not be stupid enough to think that this is a totally established state. Here I think it's just aberration, because nobody would say that socialism is an established state, but we have to deal with the historical conditions of it and the productive conditions of this formation, because they existed and we have to analyze them. So about Marx, yes, this is a drawback. I agree. I had to inscribe the late period of capital, but I don't think that interpretation of alienation would differ much. I think this is much more Althusser's decision to, because Althusser had to delineate himself from this optimistic early Marxism with these humanist ideas, because he had to deal with the society in which this cannot be implemented, and hence the sociality is negatively marked, and therefore capital is predominantly the analysis, and it doesn't give this pacified images of already achieved communism or through the change of human nature, etc., of course. But still, if you take Grundrisse, for instance, which is already 50s, I don't think the way Marx discusses alienation or labor is ideologically different from early Marx. Of course, Marx becomes a virtuoso of economic analysis already in 50s, and in 40s he does not master this virtuoso analysis, but still I don't think there is a political or ideological gap between these two. But truly, I had to have more references to the later Marx. And Distant Irony of Groys. Well, I didn't take this book as irony. For me, Communist Postscript was rather delineation of the socialist experience as untranslatable into the languages and semiology of the anti-capitalist leftism, because I think what Groys was criticizing was the anti-capitalist leftism within capitalism. By the way, today I was at the debate at the Electro Theater, and the debate was about leftism in new theater. And you wouldn't imagine that all new drama writers deal with Latour, Donna Haraway. So this theory is like squeezing and coming more and more in the Russian context. And I just asked the question for the students, and the students are answering that for them the leftist theory is simply the capacity to criticize something and the capacity to acquire certain liberation and rights. But when I asked whether leftism for them is about anti-capitalism, even not that. So anti-capitalism for them would be something radical and absolutely not politically correct. Therefore, I think Groys's critique was criticizing soft emancipation as against hard emancipation, showing communism as hard emancipation. So if we were to apply this terminology. And Andrei Madanski's question, yes, about eschatology was important, cosmology in the work by Ilyenkov and his Kosmologia Duha, Cosmology of Spirit. This is a fantastic work. Everyone who reads it is totally mind blown. Can I say so? And I would mention two interpretations of this piece. John, you remember when we were at the seminar in Berlin and we were discussing this piece, and my German colleagues, they were absolutely, they were very unhappy with this text because they said that Ilyenkov's text is so pathetic, it's so metaphysical, and it does not show the differences. So this text is absolutely manifesting communist absolutism. And this absolutism is really important, but I don't think that it's totalitarian. Whereas for contemporary theory, which cannot apply emancipatory terms without tradition of differentiation, it cannot see gender difference, it cannot see racial difference, it cannot see various south, east, north differentiations. Therefore, such text that only applies certain common cause is hostile for them and not understandable as something that posits emancipation. This was very interesting. Whereas my Russian students who read the same text, they said, oh, it's so good, it's so metaphysical, thank God it's not truly Marxist. So you can imagine that both for the leftist Western appraisal, it is not sufficiently Marxist, but for the non-leftist Russian liberal students who expect something religious, mystical, because they are interested in this post-rational new materialisms and mystified conditions of artistic practices, this text really applies to them. So those who need emancipation in contemporary terms, they did not take it as emancipation. And those who need something mystical, they really took it for, I don't know, their own symbolic credo. And this is quite paradoxic for me. And I tried to explain that this eschatological motive is not religious. On the contrary, it's extremely secular and it's extremely Marxist. And Nikolai's questions, yes, about Althusser, how we would connect ideology of Althusser and the idea or the ideal of Ilyenkov. I think there is definitely a divergence here because ideology as well as power for Foucault, as well as apparatuses for him, they are marked negatively. So they are ambivalent. And I try to show this in my book that they are some sort of Möbius. They work in Möbius logic. They confirm something, they affirm something by negating. And the more they claim something as negative, the more it is applied as emancipatory. The more subject is subjugation, the more subjugation is important to construct subjectivity, and therefore negativity is inscribed into sociality. Sociality cannot do without subjugation. In this Marxist context, where it is impossible to imagine the completely emancipated society, it is important to live with this negativity, to live with this Möbius ambivalent logic when power is everywhere, but then we have to invent differentiations within power and some logics of subversion within power, within order, within law. Whereas the idea of Ilyenkov is a very optimistic notion in terms of it really evolves itself in some kind of sociality which has accomplished its purification from capitalist logic, from the logic when you shouldn't be afraid that power will be capitalist power, that order will be capitalist order or exploiting order. So all those notions which are holistic notions, they cannot be claimed in capitalist conditions as affirmative. Whereas Ilyenkov shows that this affirmation might be possible in case you devoid society from the symptoms that instigate subjugation. I don't know, maybe this is truly idealist, but that the thinkers of Marxism were believing in it and were truly constructing epistemology on this new post-revolutionary or post-capitalist context. This is absolutely evident. This you can see in the works of Vygotsky as well, or in the works of another psychologist, Leontiev. And another question of Nikolai about Bibler. I didn't know Bibler deeply. I just looked through and I was amazed how many affinities there are and how closely they were inscribed into Hegelian tradition and Hegelian understanding of what is universal and interpreting culture as something universal. It can be in dialogue, but it's not multiculturalism. At the same time, you come across there the notions similar to Ilyenkov, which is всеобщее, which is the general but also this idea of othering within culture, which is Hegelian Anderssein. And Andrei Madanski was the first person who showed how Hegelian Anderssein works in Ilyenkov, and I borrowed this from him. So truly, Ilyenkov also has this technique of othering constantly, because universality is impossible without inobытие, othering, the capacity of each objecthood or each thing to be constantly in other hypostases. And this makes dialectical fusion and dialectical procedure possible. Whereas if you have the aggregation, for instance, in actor network theory, you should only have the particles, the selves which are nominal selves, absolutely immanent selves, and absolutely literal selves, which aggregate performatively, but they don't need this fusion, they don't need this becoming, they don't need this accumulative process of becoming the other and growing into the other, which of course is Marxist and which is Hegelian. And concerning Baudelaire, I'm not a big specialist in it, but what was interesting is, and what Ilyenkov has also in terms of affinity with Baudelaire is, of course, this idea that the relations of production can affect back the productive forces. This I first came across in the abstract and concrete in Ilyenkov's work, and I came across this idea that somehow relations of production can conversely can somehow reverse their impact on productive forces and on the technique and on infrastructure, rather than this classical Marxist idea that productive forces are stronger in their affectation and influence on sociality. So the basis is much more important to affect the superstructure. But Baudelaire shows that superstructure can affect back the basis, and Ilyenkov also has this idea. Just to answer short and give the floor to other questions, and I shut up here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, are we ready to take questions from the audience? Or there will be any follow-ups from our commentators? It's up to you. Okay, then. Dear friends, so you can now ask your questions, and I will repeat the same in Russian. Дорогие друзья, сейчас, пожалуйста, самое время задать ваши вопросы. Кети, у нас еще остается некоторое время. Мы ориентировочно заканчиваем в 8, но, в принципе, конечно, можно оставить просто конференцию работающую для выяснения каких-то вопросов, которые вас очень волнуют. Please go ahead.
Oh. Vernacular Marxism. Yes, Nikolai's question about vernacular Marxism. Yes, this is a great research of yours. I was really impressed, and I only touched upon it in terms of conceptuality of the material culture of the Soviet context, because it is so ideologized. The idea is so much it is permeating the daily life so much that it becomes conceptual in unmediated way. So it is vernacularly Marxist and vernacularly conceptual. And this, I would only agree with this vernacular Marxism, but I think it's it has more the interest of collector. So you are right, it has this ethnographic element, and I think I study this element of idea present in daily materiality through logical issues, through logical analysis of Ilyenkov's mind and body dialectics.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can I ask a question? Yeah, I think this is quite an important question. I want to reflect on some of the things that you say right at the end of the book, where you mentioned this in passing, actually. You talk about the boredom and hardship involved in the struggle for communism, which is a very different kind of transformative epistemology than we usually expect from emancipatory discourse. That is, where communism today, with a small c, is spoken of, it's usually talked about in relation to multiplicity, plenipotentiality, and the release of difference. Could you talk a little bit about that distinction, please?
So why communism is boredom, and how come I dare to call communism boredom? And
no, I'm not saying not saying that you are. That's a dare, but your understanding of communism with a small c through your critique of libidinal economy leads you to talk about boredom and hardship instead of plenipotentiality, multiplicity, and difference.
Yeah, but well, I think that when I used this word boredom, I meant impossibility to digest the necessities of communism. So impossibility to digest this non-libidinal basic need economy, which was the fate, the fatality of this kind of sociality, bringing it to decomposition, because without desire, the production and productive forces, they decompose. But boredom was much more a metaphor than something that we have to aspire for as the model of emancipation. It's more like a question that how can we imagine communism which has to be based and organized as equality, and if equality presupposes radical eradication of certain elements, coercive criminalization of private property, of imaginary forms. I mean, everybody talks against Marx when they emphasize that Marxist rigidity would imply eradication of this imaginary richness of creativity, of desire, of libidinality. Castoriadis talks about them. Even Lyotard talks about them. All the theorists of 60s emphasize that. Karl Polanyi emphasizes that Marxist economism is very rigid, and he extrapolates the logic of capitalist society on the previous societies and on all other societies. So in this sense, even in Marx, if we implement what Marx is demanding from us, like live with the interests of another person, this will be boring. I mean, for a capitalist subject, it is boring, but for an ideal communist subject, this is bliss. This is the point.
I know that, but you haven't really answered my question. Anyway, yeah, go on.
Yeah, but
we
we had two questions from Sasha Freiberg.
Yes, we have more questions. Therefore, please first two questions from Sasha Freiberg and then a question from Anna Kruglov. Comment. Brother.
Yes, thank you, Keti, for your presentation. I think your book points to very crucial points. More than as a historical re-evaluation or a comparison, I see it as a contemporary intervention, so to say, which also poses questions like what actually is theory, I mean, with a big T. Also, it gives us something to think in relation with the old question about the primacy of ideas versus the primacy of structure or infrastructure. In this respect, is very interesting. And this relates to my first question. I have two questions, one more concerning the reach of your method. I will, so to say, not pose a counterexample, but pose a question because of a personal interest, but I think it matches also content-wise the thematic framework of your book, which I see as a kind of well, attempt to at least try to speak about something like communist ethics, you know, in a very basic sense. In this respect, your critique of the Western left is very much Lifshitzian, so to say, who thought that's the problem of the century, is this kind of wrong left. First question.
Sasha, we can't hear you.
Yeah, we are losing you.
Now, is it better now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, sorry. When you argue that the differences of Western and Soviet perspectives are based more or less on socio-economic conditions, I'm wondering what could be the role, what role could the tradition play, which is a kind of alternative to the Marxist tradition and then to the Soviet tradition, that is the German philosophy of culture. I have in mind in particular the Marburg school of neo-Kantianism, which on the one hand developed alongside early Marxism and developed a similar psychology, aesthetics, and socialist ethics, as we can see in Ilyenkov, for example, even in Lifshitz to some extent. So my question would be, what would follow from your method and analysis in terms of this tradition, this line which was cut because of political reasons? So the end we can explain with this method, but how can we account for its emergence? You know, this is interesting to me because I see a lot of parallels and hidden parallels in this tradition with Marxism in general and the Soviets, especially Ilyenkov, speaking about the ideal, culture, and so on. These were exactly the same notions they stressed: the unity and plurality, dialectics, objective spirit, objective, or the objectivation in culture. So this is, so to say, a kind of, it seems to be irregular in this kind of methodic framework. My second question is, you talked about the hindering that capitalism and, for example, Ilyenkov's perspective was hindering the unity of thought and being. It's, I think, a crucial question. Of course, then the question would arise in how far this relates to his letter. Yeah? You already touched upon this, that there's a kind of tension between this philosopher's perspective about the unity of thought and being, or theory and praxis, and planned economy and administrated society. So in short, the problem of technocracy. On the one hand, this pertains to the inner problem of the self.
We lost you again.
Socialist, rationalist society. On the other hand, it's of course quite interesting as a contrast foil to today's more or less hidden ideological conditions and realities, like the problem of state intervention, which always has to be covered up, or the regulations for property, for patents, and so on and so forth. So a kind of intervention for market logics. So there's no free market. You always have this kind of intervention, right? So the question pertains to what would be, or are there hints in Ilyenkov towards the concrete economical or bureaucratic organization? Did you have something in mind?
I'm sorry, before I proceed, I have to leave you in a few minutes, and I made you co-host, and I will leave the conference running, so it's no problem. I'm just will not be with you anymore. Okay.
Thank you, Alexei. Great. It was a great pleasure, and thank you for chairing. Well, concerning the German tradition, I think I don't know it deeply enough, but you already told me about it. So it would be another contribution to refer back to those notions when they had been lost in the contemporary theory after Second World War. Culture, the ideal, the idea, etc. We simply did not inherit those notions, and I think it's already probably your preoccupation maybe to demonstrate those connections. This would be really interesting. As for Ilyenkov, he was not an economist, but he definitely needed to interfere into party organization. Firstly, as you mentioned, to somehow prohibit the development and spread of the cybernetic essentialism, which was very fashionable at the moment in 60s. And his book was written, his book was published much later, but he worked on this issue, on the critique of empiricism and technical nominalism. But as for his precise works on political economy, I think all his politeconomic analysis and how it tells on philosophy is in the dialectics of the abstract and concrete. And what he does there, he shows that look at the politeconomic passages of Marx, and now look how it works in daily life, in our reality, and look how philosophic it is. And look that this philosophy is possible to be implemented for the sake of socialist society. So he was trying to prove that Marxist political economy is absolutely realizable, but that at the same time, this realization is philosophic realization. So answering Ilya's question, Ilya Budraitsky's question, this society is philosophic because Marx is philosophic and not simply politeconomic. So conversely to leftist apologia of Marx about 11th thesis of Feuerbach, that philosophers were trying to understand this work, but we have to change this work. Of course, this is true, but Ilyenkov shows that Marx's point is also to show that the socio-economic issues are nonetheless philosophic, and vice versa. Philosophic issues are nonetheless social and economic. And I think this dialectics is crucial for Ilyenkov. As for concrete administrative organization, I don't think he had access to that. And Anna Kruglova had a question.
It's not so much a question, maybe a commentary. Unfortunately, I only heard about this book today, so I haven't read it. And from what I can only understand is from what I heard today, but my comment will be very good in terms of kind of wrapping up this discussion, because I really want to thank you so much for writing this book. And I only regret that it hasn't been written in somewhere about 2014 and 15, when I was working on my dissertation, which was on a contemporary ethics of Russians of about like 40-year-olds. So those people who actually grew up in the late socialism, they were raised in the, I would dare say, ontology, which was the late socialist ontology. And unfortunately, as an ethnographer, I faced kind of a double task. I first had to translate ethnographic reality, what my respondents say, the ethical decisions which they take in their daily lives, into theory, which in my case was theory, of course, the people whom you mentioned, Michel Foucault, the Saint, Bruno Latour, Deleuze and Guattari, and so on and so forth, which constitutes the usual critical theory and philosophy, which kind of infuses the bachelor degrees in any Western university. So, and I saw very little kind of understanding how I can translate into that, while at the same time, I understand that when I started reading a lot of literature on what was Soviet socialism and so on and so forth, historical anthropology for whatever little there is, but also Boris Groys and Sergei Ushakin, and so on and so on, many people. I also kind of couldn't find real philosophical accounts which would take that system at its face value, as indeed the systems of ethics and ontology, and look at it from the point of view of transnational philosophical usual problem: order versus how, chaos, abstract and concrete, mind and matter. I was literally flabbergasted. I always thought that my research was failing. There is this wonderful book somewhere, but I can't find it. But then I despaired, it wasn't there. Whatever little I found from people who took it kind of from this point of view was David Zilberman. I don't know if you heard about such a person, who was had a very interesting career of шестидесятник, then moved to West and so on. So he basically was, and he studied Indian, he was an Indologist, you would say. So he was an anthropologist or cultural studies scholar, and he looked at the Soviet society from a point of view which was not necessarily about institutions, history, state participation, gulag camps, and so on, but basically at the kind of a value system per se, from philosophical point of view. And he was very educated in Vedic philosophy. Yeah, so
very interesting for me what you say, because actually you usually get accusation for shifting to
as well. Yeah. Why, like, how it's exactly, it's funny how talking about this requires daring. How dare you consider boredom as an emancipatory project? I mean, you're philosophers. You should dare consider boredom a bliss. Why would you even think about daring? And it's really, really funny that philosophers are so timid these days, or so having blindfolds on their eyes could not possibly connect boredom with theory, with bliss, for instance. So when I was talking about desire, or like looking at how people use desire they talk about what anthropologists would call vitalism. We deal in, animism, totemism, vitalism, that sort of worldwide systems. And I'm trying to connect it. For instance, they talk about how the necessarily expenditure of desire, and indeed it's economism, it's a very economic kind of system, expenditure of desire would lead to suffering. I said, like, okay, how desire is connected to suffering? What should I read? My, of course, supervisor would say, read Marquis de Sade. Ha, ha, ha. You understand what Marquis de Sade doesn't go into the libidinal economy at all. My leftist friend, who eventually, I don't know, read Kropotkin and who not, because he's a fashionable anarchist, he would talk, read Deleuze and Guattari, anti-Oedipus or whatnot. I read it and I understand that there is nothing suffering about there as well, because these people never lived this economy of desire. They theorized it, but they did not understand how it can be.
I'm very grateful to your comments, because actually this was a very long way when I started this research, and you hear accusation, why you are not applying Foucault precisely in this way. I apply Foucault, but I need to make differentiations, because something functions, something doesn't function. And we have to make these divisions, and you are absolutely right. So we need the tools.
Yes, well, in Russian, there is a saying, натягивать сову на глобус. This is how often it happens. Basically, to take an owl and to stretch it over a global, which means, I don't know, in English, it might be correspondence, to try to take something square and to put it on something round, right? This is what usually happens when you're trying to do these things. So the starting point exactly should not be either Michel Foucault or some other saint. It should be actually something which is taken at face value, or maybe some general ideas, like exactly order versus chaos, how people understand action, why action, agency, and activity are three different things. And local semiotic ideology may assume completely different understanding of what it means. Exactly. So basically, yeah, that's sort of a kind of a thing. It was too daunting, because it required to write 2 books at once, and it required a philosophical education, which I do not have, so I'm kind of sorry. Usually anthropologists have a bliss of either having official and vernacular ideology sort of understand and kind of coincide, like Papua New Guinea. You do not have a system of institutions who worked for 70 years to socially engineer for people a way of life and ethics and consciousness and something else. So Marilyn Strathern can go and just talk with her respondents and from there derive her ontology. Historical context sort of almost doesn't exist there from that point of view. And somewhere in India, you have a caboodle of local philosophers who for, I don't know, 3rd generation will connect it from whoever the Vedic kind of local tradition with, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't happen. So yeah, I can understand that I'm a bit emotional about it, because
no, but it's also the
questions for so long and no one can answer me. Everybody would say, why? There is this constant institutionalism. When what was socialism, what was next, was always about some sort of institution. We had critique of that. Nothing happened. Nothing happened.
I think that there should be separate debate on that. This is very important, which brings different points, East and West, and generally the universality of the theory that claims to be universal in terms of emancipatory theory as such. So these are great points. I think we are exceeding the time, which is the time of the Wishka school, and maybe we have to wrap up. And I would like to thank everyone. I hope that we could meet on other sessions and for other occasions, and it was extremely precious for me to have this debate and discussion, and I'm looking forward to other meetings. So
yes,
great, and ciao.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye then.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.